So the Jews are here. To try to say that they weren't here and that the Palestinians were here thousands of years ago is ridiculous. Anybody who can, you can actually Google this.
Here's a video clip with two big personalities, Bibi Netanyahu and Dr. Jordan Peterson. So Dr. Peterson opens up by inviting Bibi to just broadly, generally make the case for the state of Israel, which he does. And then Dr. Peterson responds with a more specific question that Bibi responds to and addresses. In the first half here, when Bibi's making the case in general, there's something that he does that I actually really appreciate. Something that I've been saying for a long time. I think on average, Muslims get right a lot better than everybody else does, on average, again. And something that I've been saying for a while is a page that a lot of people, a lot of other people can and should be taking out of, the playbook of Muslims. Let's have a listen.
I know that there's tremendous constant noise about issues as fundamental as Israel's right to exist even. And you start by talking about, in your book, you embark on explaining that, at least in some part, by talking about Herzl and his terror that anti-Semitism, that the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe was going to cause a catastrophe, which was obviously a justified terror. Would you be kind enough to walk me and my viewers and listeners through your rationale for the moral justification for Israel, the political justification as well? And I'm going to do what I can to my limited ability, let's say, to push back. I've heard the arguments of often young people who are more prone to give credence and sympathy, say, to the Palestinian viewpoint. And I'd like to rectify my ignorance and maybe help my viewers and listeners do the same thing. So would it be useful to start with Herzl?
Well, I'd start, Herzl was what I call our modern Moses, but I'd actually start with the original Moses. The Jewish people have lived in the land of Israel, what is now the state of Israel, have lived here and have been attached to this place for about 3,500 years. 3.5 millennia. Now, for the first 2 millennia, roughly, of that time, we were living in what is described in a text commonly known as the Bible. So the Bible describes how the Jewish people lived on this land, were attached to this land, fought off conquerors, sometimes were conquered, but stayed on their land. And that continued for a very long time until roughly the 7th century, actually, after the birth of Christ, okay? For roughly 2,000 years. We were conquered by the Romans, we were conquered by the Byzantines. They did a lot of bad things to us, but they didn't really exile us, contrary to what people think, okay? The loss of our land actually occurred when the Arab conquest took place in the 7th century. The Arabs burst out from Arabia, and they did something that no other conqueror, not the Romans, not the Byzantines, not the Greeks before them, not Alexander the Great, nobody did before. They actually started taking over the land of the Jewish farmer. They brought in military colonies that took over the land. And gradually, over the next 2 centuries, the Jews became a minority in our land. So it is under the Arab conquest that the Jews lost their homeland. The Arabs were the colonials. The Jews were the natives dispossessed. Well, that happens in history. The Jews were dispossessed. We were flung to the far corners of the earth, suffered unimaginable suffering because we had no homeland. But we didn't disappear, and we never gave up the dream of coming back to our ancestral homeland. So generation after generation, the Jews could be in Warsaw, they could be in Yemen, they could be in China. And they said, next year in Jerusalem, we'll come back next year in Jerusalem. Well, that was made possible because the Arabs who had conquered the land basically left it barren. They never made it their own. It was a barren land. It really it was an empty land. And in the 19th century, the idea of coming back next year in Jerusalem became a reality. By the way, in part because of Christian Zionist support for the idea of the Great Return. The Jews came back in the 19th century to the land of Israel. The result of this return was that we started building farms, factories, places of employment. Arabs from nearby countries started immigrating, and they call themselves Palestinians. They reconstructed history and said, we've been here for centuries. No, they haven't. They weren't there at all, and they didn't have a national consciousness. We came back, made it our land, and we said, okay, we now will live together. We decided to establish a state in 1948, that's 75 years ago, and we said, everybody can live here. The Arabs said, there can't be a Jewish state. You have no right to be here. It's our land. It's not your land. It's been our land for 3,500 years. If you took over somebody's apartment, knocked them out, dispossessed them, and they never gave up the claim, and they said it's our claim, and you left this barren dump, okay? And the families, the progeny of the people you kicked out, came back, rebuilt the house. You cannot come back and tell them, you don't belong here, we're going to kick you out, especially since you're latecomers who've come to live in part of the house, which is what the so-called Palestinians are, okay? We say to them, you can live here, we can live here, but it's our land, it's our state. And the reason this conflict continues is because the Palestinians, who represent the colonial powers, the Arab conquest of the Middle East and beyond, they are saying, you have no right for a Jewish state. Well, we do. If any people has any right to a state, if any people never gave up their dreams of returning to their ancestral home, if any people rebuilt their home from nothing, from barren, wasted land, it's the Jewish people. To tell them, you have suffered more than anyone else. You have never lost your dream of coming back and rebuilding your national life in your ancestral homeland. You have no right to be there. But the Arabs who are trying to destroy you, they have that right. That is a complete perversion of history and also a complete perversion of justice. The Jews belong to this land belongs to the Jews. The Palestinians are free to live here next to us, among us, but they're not free to demand the dissolution of the Jewish state. That is not justice, that is injustice. That's the shortest lecture I can give you about Jewish history.
So, first of all, I mean, you like Bibi, love him, hate him, discuss the arguments on the merits. I mean, the case he makes is pretty solid. Go argue with the facts, or debate the facts, discuss the facts. People are going to immediately respond. A lot of people respond, oh, he's genocide and a war criminal and blah, blah, blah. Obviously, all of those claims are farcical, as I already talked about in the wake of this absurd joke of an ICC ruling. But be that as it may, yes or no, serious, farcical, whatever it is, none of that has to do with the arguments that he makes. When people respond to an argument by attacking the person who made the argument, that's not a very good sign for their own belief and confidence in their arguments, which is why instead of addressing the arguments, they'll attack the person. So, I mean, the case he makes is solid. Solid argument. Go. I'm not sure what someone's going to say in response to that to claim otherwise. That's first of all. Second of all, and this is the thing I alluded to in the introduction, Bibi did something here that, it wouldn't hold much weight in a court of law, right? Obviously, you can't bring the Bible, you can't bring the Torah, you can't bring a religious text as evidence of something in a court case, in a court of law. But this isn't a legal court case, this video, and I really appreciate the fact that Bibi, number one, is going back to the ancient history, to the broader picture. He could have gone even a little further back, but be that as it may, and the fact that he quotes the Bible. I've been saying for a long time that something I admire, that I see a lot among Muslims, and that I think more people ought to admire and more people ought to emulate or to take a lesson from, is that on average, I think that religious Muslims tend to be less apologetic than religious people of most other faiths, or all other faiths, as far as I've seen. They will say what they believe, they'll say it loudly, and they'll say it proudly, and they have no shame, they don't apologize, they don't excuse it, they believe it. and they'll stand up for it. They'll say what they believe, and they're proud of it. And if you do believe something, you should be ready to stand up for it. I think that's the right thing. Now, the extent to which I obviously have differences in, theology, etc., is a separate conversation. But the fact that they have this, on average, tend, I would say, to have this pride and confidence and unapologetic respect for and pride in what they believe to be true is admirable, and it's exactly the way it should be. And I really like the way that Bibi, refers back to that, refers to the religious origins of the claim, not because I think it's a super good argument technically in a legal sense, or, within the context of a debate per se. That being said, on the other hand, these sorts of arguments do carry weight, right? There's a certain respect and a hesitance that people have to argue in general with Muslims, and I think that a big part of that is the pride and the confidence that they have and the unapologetic nature of their respect for their faith. And even if it wouldn't be a valid argument in a court of law, it's something that human beings perceive as being valid, right? As human beings who live in a world that's influenced by narrative, etc., it's not just facts that determine our experience and our perceptions and the weight that we give to various arguments. The narratives and the feelings, etc., are a very important part of that. And at the end of the day, we, consciously or subconsciously, we pick up on and we notice respect and confidence. And we notice when people are apologetic and not really confident or not really proud of what they're standing for. And the fact that he has this pride to refer back to the foundational texts of his faith, of our faith, I think is an important and powerful thing. Again, I'm not saying that that makes it a solid argument in a court of law, but I think it does make for a solid argument in the court of, I wouldn't say, public opinion, which is the kind of thing people usually say, but more in the court of public perception and human experience. Because we as people respect when we see people who respect themselves and respect what they believe in and have the courage and confidence to stand up for it. And I really appreciate that he did that here. Anyway, let's continue.
So why do you think the claim that the Palestinians were somehow there in Israel first and have been displaced in a colonial occupation, let's say, by the Jews, why do you think that idea has gained such cachet, not least in the West?
Because of ignorance? I mean, what do you mean they were here first? Well, you're familiar with the story of Jesus, right? Jesus was a Jewish rabbi living here 2,000 years ago. He was a rabbi from the Galilee, okay? He came to Jerusalem, he turned the money tables of the tables of the money changers on the Temple Mount. Where did that happen? Did it happen in Tibet? It happened here. Jerusalem was our capital. King David made it our capital 3,000 years ago. So the Jews are here. To try to say that they weren't here and that the Palestinians were here thousands of years ago is ridiculous. Anybody who can, you can actually Google this and find out how absurd this thing is. So as far as reinventing ancient history, that is unpardonable, because anybody can find out and understand that the Jews were here for thousands of years, the Palestinians weren't here. As far as modern times are concerned, what the Palestinians have said is, and I write this in my book, and I show it because it's so comical. What they say is, we were here, Palestine was a verdant land in the 19th century, teeming with the Palestinians, until the Jews came in, took it over and threw it out. Okay, well, that's what Arafat effectively said in his infamous speech in the United Nations, blaming Zionism, equating Zionism with racism. Well, there's only one problem with that. He said that the Jewish invasion of this verdant Palestinian homeland happened in 1881, okay? The problem with that is that 12 years before, a famous visitor among hundreds of visitors named Mark Twain visited the Holy Land. And he describes a totally different picture. He describes Palestine, I'm quoting him, is a vast wasteland. He said, only imagination can grace this barren land with the pomp of circumstance and life. It's just, he said, we traveled for a whole day. We didn't see, in the Galilee, we didn't see a human being, one single human being. He said, Jerusalem sits in sackcloth and ashes. And as he was saying that, it's the Jewish return that began, building the land. Well, perhaps one could argue, it's obvious that Mark Twain was not in the service of the Jewish state because it didn't exist. He wasn't in the service of the Jewish lobby because there wasn't any Jewish lobby. He was just reporting what was there. Could there possibly have been a tremendous influx of Palestinians between 1869 and 1881, the year that Arafat says the Jewish invasion began and destroyed the Palestinian paradise? Well, alas, no, because in the year 1881, another famous visitor visits Israel, and he visits this land, and he writes also his memoirs, okay? His name was Arthur Penrhyn Stanley. He was a very famous courtier of Queen Victoria's court, okay? And he came here on a special visit. And he says, I look south and I look north. He says, I'm in Judea. And I see nothing, he says, a barren expanse. And they both express, both Twain and Arthur Penrhyn Stanley say the same thing. When will the Jews come back and bring this land to life? And the answer is right then. We came back, brought it back to life. There were Arabs living here, but it was, as I say, a barren wasteland. But Arabs began to immigrate naturally because we created a rise in the standard of living that attracted Arabs from neighboring states. Those Arabs are now the descendants of those Arabs who migrated as a result of the Jewish return. Many of them now are considered Palestinians. So what I'm saying, and I'm saying this to you, Jordan, and to your audience, there has been a complete fabrication of history. It's the biggest lie of the big lies that have permeated the 20th century and the 21st century, is to say that the Arabs were here before, that is, the Palestinians were here before the Jews, when we were here for thousands of years, that we are the colonials, when in fact it was the Arabs who were the colonials who dispossessed the original natives, and that is the Jews, that we came back to this land that was laid barren by the Arab conquest, brought it back to life, and allowed Arab immigration, what we call now Palestinian immigration, to come back in. And now they say to us, in unimaginable chutzpah, they say, you don't belong here. They recreate ancient history, they recreate modern history, and this is a lot of hokum. It's ridiculous.
Okay, so on this second half, again, Bibi makes a very, strong case, and I would say, if you don't like it, argue on its merits before you start, before people start insulting him and calling him, this name, that name, and the other name. Argue on the merits of, discuss on the merits of the argument, on the merits of the case he makes. Now, there's one thing here that I would disagree with, I would say relatively strongly, right? Because Dr. Peterson asked him, why do you think this idea of Israel as a colonial occupation has gained so much weight? And Bibi responds that the reason is because of ignorance. I don't think that's true. I think that there is an enormous amount of ignorance involved around this issue, a tremendous amount of ignorance. People walking around like a bunch of sheep just bleating out things that, they heard their friends say or that they saw someone say on CNN, and they just repeat it like a bunch of sheep or robots, drones, whatever it is. And they have no idea how absurd the things they're saying are and how contrary they are to basic, simple facts. But that's not the reason. I would say that facilitates the fact that these absurd, not just false, but counter to the truth narratives have picked up so much weight and momentum. It's because of a very intentional, deliberate effort that's being made to gaslight. That's the real reason. right? I mean, the things, the concept of Israel being a colonial occupation is so beyond absurd. It's the ridiculousness of it is literally laughable. If it weren't so dangerous, it would be actually a joke. It's just not a joke because of the danger that it carries. But this is intentional manipulation by, there's a huge part to which Hamas and their tactics of inflating, of intentionally causing Palestinian civilians to be killed and injured plays a part in it. And then all of the corporate media just love to talk about this, Israel as occupiers and as this colonial occupation, which has nothing in common with the truth. It's a blatant lie, but what happens when you repeat a blatant lie again and again and again and again without shame? And in a sense, the blatantness of the lie makes it more powerful because it makes it, the absurdity of it makes it really difficult to think that people would say something so absurd if it weren't actually true, because it seems to be so wrong that surely it would have to be true for people to say something like that. So it's the level of the blatantness of the lie and the consistency with which is repeated again and again, repeatedly, dozens of times a day, and this is going on already for decades, certainly years. It's not a new thing that's just happening now, but the cause of this absurd narrative of Israel as a colonial state is not because of ignorance. Its ability to pick up steam and momentum is facilitated by widespread, complete ignorance, but that's not the driving force behind it. The driving force behind it, I would say, is much more malicious. It's an intentional, malicious campaign to gaslight and to repeat absurd, blatant lies again and again and again, to the point that people almost, I would say, have no choice to believe it. They do have a choice, but the people who don't have much in the way of brains and just hear it again and again and again and assume that it must be true, they just think it is. And they're convinced that it's fact. It's not ignorance. It's way worse than that. It's way more dangerous and way more malicious. This is an intentional, malicious campaign to gaslight a generation, and unfortunately, it's had a pretty high degree of success so far. I mean, look at people, young adults, chanting in the streets from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They have no idea what they're saying. Globalize the Intifada. They have no idea that they're literally promoting not just violence, but brutal murder of innocent civilians, targeting women, children. They don't even know what they're saying. But because Israel is a colonial occupation, that's what someone said on CNN and someone else said on BBC, so therefore that means it's true. It's malicious and it's intentional. It's not just ignorance. It's facilitated by ignorance.